Blood drips from their mouths.
You're a Sonali. More news from 6, but for now, hope you settled in for a spooky time with your favourite ghost hunters, because the Phantom Finds team are at it again.
Simon whistled between his teeth as he poked his head through another identical doorway. "Claire?" he called, trying to keep his tone light. "Come on now, this is getting ridiculous." Much of the cheery veneer had vanished from his voice over the last 30 minutes, leaving an undercurrent of irritation and exhaustion. The corridor ahead of him sat dark and empty. Wallpaper dangled from the ceiling like papery stalactites. An upturned service trolley lay abandoned up ahead, blocking the way like some sleeping beast. The air smelled of dampness and untouched rooms. Simon rolled his eyes with a sigh and closed the door, turning back to the passageway he'd been methodically working his way down. It was growing dark inside the hotel. Corridors seemed longer, rooms larger. Shadows collected in distant corners like spilled ink, blotting out doorways, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Or more importantly, frame a shot. They could have settled for filming with Ian, Simon supposed. Claire would have been found eventually, and they could have filled in any gaps later on with voiceover. But Felmore was special. They had to do it right, and Ian simply wasn't. In many ways, Simon regarded Ian Sinclair as one might a battered but beloved car accessory. Functionally unnecessary, but good for nostalgia. A defunct artifact of the past whose use was ultimately finite. It was time for fresh faces in front of the camera, younger hands at the wheel. Simon was sure Ian understood that himself, deep down. In his pitch to the network, Simon had described Phantom Finds as a body he'd inherited. Fired all but the most essential crew and moulded into something guaranteed to turn a profit. But a body nonetheless. Philippa was the eye, or possibly the arm, bringing their work to the adoring public. Alex was the ears, or maybe the lungs, providing their voice. Ian was the mouth, crooked and in need of repair but still functionally adequate. Claire was the face, of course. And Simon was the brain. Hotels were much the same, he thought. Vast animals of brick and marble, with corridor arteries and lobby lungs, breathing guests in and out through gaping doors, funneling staff from room to room like blood through veins. Simon grinned, impressed by his own wit. He'd have to write that down. He checked his watch, his grin fading. It was 1800 hours already. 3 hours until night security arrives. What on earth was everyone doing? Sure, he'd lied about being granted access to Felmore, but nobody else knew that. Oh, he'd sent letters to the right people, but the responses back had been curt, to say the least. Nobody had entered the building properly in over 30 years, just the occasional security guard or wayward teen, and the remote location meant even they were a rarity. The current owner, a billionaire CEO from Texas, hadn't been to the UK in years and was simply waiting for the building to collapse so he could pull it down for flats. Nobody was allowed inside, especially not a long-defunct TV show with a shoestring budget and heavy, lawsuit-waiting to happen equipment. But that only made it all the more tantalizing. Eventually, Simon had resorted to desperate measures. He bought a key off a security guard living in Preston. A huge fan of the show, apparently, and more than happy to regale Simon with most of the stories he'd added to the final script, paying a considerable amount for what could well have been defunct, or a dupe. Even now it sat in his back pocket, heavy with the weight of personal victory. The way Simon's heart had leapt when it fitted in the lock, playing it cool as the hotel doors swung open, permitting them access. This is what his job was all about, facilitating the impossible, driving the production forward into a brand new era. This was his show, and nobody, not an argumentative crew, not a prima donna presenter, and not a no trespassing order, was going to ruin it for him. Perhaps they'd run into legal issues once the episode aired, but in his heart, Simon knew it was worth the risk. He knew a priceless location when he saw one, and Felmore was a veritable gold mine, untouched by every other paranormal show on the market, not the same old hodgepodge of crumbling castles and rotten manors, the same endless parade of legend and hearsay. This was Felmore Hotel, unseen by the public for decades. Something to really shake up the viewership. If only the others knew how hard he worked. A distant thud interrupted his thoughts. Simon jumped, ducking instinctively against the wall. Had a night watchman arrived early? He'd made sure to park the van out of sight from the road. Surely nobody had spotted them. No. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from behind him, deeper inside the hotel. "Claire!" Simon hissed, his whisper carrying across the empty corridor. "Ian!" The soft sound answered him, rising and falling in the stillness, a muffled murmur of voices. Somewhere nearby, people were talking. Simon unfolded from his crouch, his chest lightening with relief. The others were back. They'd have time to wrap filming and be out of here before dark. Everything was going to be all right. He looked around, struggling to determine where exactly the voices were coming from. They'd be on their way back to the lobby, surely. Maybe he could catch them off guard. Jump from a hiding place as a good-natured punishment for wasting so much filming time. Prove he was still one of the team, still up for some gentle ribbing. The voices weren't getting any closer. Simon attempted his trusted director voice. Cheery, with just a hint of fatherly firmness, so the others knew he meant business. "Come on, you lot! Back to the lobby!" The voices continued. Off in the distance, someone laughed. Simon straightened his shoulders and marched forward, following the sound, emboldened by the shadows seeping across the floor, the nagging belligerence that he was being ignored by his own crew. Leaves stirred at his feet. The voices grew louder as he reached the end of the corridor, seeming to emanate from behind a dark, narrow doorway, half concealed by a ragged curtain. A shortcut, maybe. A service corridor, connecting two sections of the hotel, allowing discreet movement of maid staff and cleaning equipment. Simon eased open the door and peered inside. Instead of a connecting corridor, it led into a cramped, poorly lit stairwell. A single window sat high in the wall overhead, casting dregs of red sunset through a haze of dust and ancient cobwebs. A staff stairway, somewhere hidden from guests and prying eyes, leading up through the dark, secret places of the hotel. Not a shortcut back to the lobby, then. Simon was about to turn back to the corridor when a shadow shifted on the landing above him, just visible past the stairs. Too large to be an animal, decidedly human. Simon turned, squinting against the growing shadows. "Claire?" Nobody replied. Simon frowned, affecting an air of false cheeriness. He took the stairs two at a time to the next landing, ignoring the groan of floorboards beneath his feet. He rounded the corner. "Come on. Some of us want to get home on time to..." The landing was identical to the one he'd just left, empty and drifting with dust. No sign of Claire. No sign of anyone. Simon paused, breathing in the dusty air, the dying sunlight prickling his skin. Something about the stairway felt off. Was it crooked somehow? He glanced upward, watching the strings of ancient cobwebs dangle down out the shadows. The ceiling was higher than expected, perhaps, the deepening shadows giving the peeling red wallpaper the impression of something sodden, as if it grew wetter the higher it climbed. Just an old flight of stairs, lost in a ruined building in the middle of nowhere. How many identical such places had Simon visited over the last few months? How many had he been forced to transform into places worth visiting, embellishing story after story of creaking floorboards and sudden chills told by wide-eyed proprietors hoping for a business boost, spinning something from nothing. If only they knew how hard he worked. The stairs creaked overhead. A shadow flickered across the opposite wall. Someone whispered something in the darkness beyond the next landing, almost on the cusp of hearing. Claire? Simon forced away the dryness at the back of his throat. Philippa? Ian? Was this a prank? Retribution for the long filming days and tireless nights? A crew rebellion? Simon heaved a sigh. Right. Okay, fine. Very funny. As he started up the stairs again, something sharp stabbed his hand from the banister. He jerked it away with a grimace, inspecting his palm. A tiny shoot of blood glistened in the exact center. The red turned almost black by the darkness. Simon hissed under his breath, wiping his hand on his trousers. Damned splinters. He kept climbing, careful to only brush his fingers against the handrail from now on. The next landing was empty too, so was the one after that, and the next. Those muffled footsteps always just around the next corner, the shadows on the wall always just a second too fast to catch. The banister felt wet now, tacky beneath Simon's fingertips. Simon ignored it as he climbed, quickening his pace with each new turn, exasperation giving way to anger, sharpened with a deep, nagging unease. As he reached the sixth identical landing, the unease finally resolved into realization. Simon paused, his hand gripping the banister. Felmore only had 5 floors. He knew it only had 5 floors. He'd counted them outside. He glanced over his shoulder. Behind him, the stairs spiraled away into darkness. Dust hung in the shadows, giving the air a loamy haze. Simon was struck with a sudden sensation of impermanence, as if the staircase only existed as far as he could personally see it. And after that, he shook himself. He'd miscounted, that was all. He'd reach the final landing soon. He'd find the others. He'd have this whole thing wrapped and done, and then they'd be on to the next location within an hour. As he moved towards the next flight, something sharp jabbed at the underside of his foot. What the hell? Wincing, Simon caught himself on the nearest wall and lifted his shoe to inspect the underside. Was that a smear of red against the sole? A tiny hole made by something sharp enough to pierce the leather. Simon turned his gaze to the floor, inspecting it for nails or sharpened debris. The light from the distant windows had darkened to a dark, rich red, flooding the landing with shadows, but something seemed to ripple in the darkness directly ahead, an almost imperceptible shifting across the floorboards. Simon squinted, trying to determine what exactly he was seeing. As he made to move forward again, something sticky pulled at the back of his shirt, the nape of his neck, his hair, trying to drag him back. Simon jerked free with a hiss of disgust, wiping at the back of his neck. His palm came back slick with a thin, red sheen. Disgust prickling his spine, Simon turned to stare at the wall behind him. It seemed to bristle, catching the light oddly. He peered closer. Minute hairs peppered the wallpaper, almost invisible to the naked eye. Moss, maybe? Some kind of strange fungi? Simon grimaced. Whatever it was, he wouldn't be touching them again. Footsteps sounded on the floor overhead. Simon turned back to the landing. "All right," he snapped. "I'm going downstairs. If you're not all in the lobby when I get back, I'm docking your pay." He turned towards the stairs, intent on storming back down them, and froze. Someone stood on the bottom step, looking up from the landing below. A familiar shape, caught against the rapidly fading sunlight, a sensible pink sweater and a flash of blonde curls. Simon nearly sagged against the banister. Claire?
Simon.
Simon started down the stairs towards her. Look, we need to go. We need to find the others, call some sort of exterminator, I don't... Something made him pause. A shifting of shadows, perhaps, some jolt of animal instinct in the back of his brain. The figure on the stairs was Claire's height, with an approximation of Claire's features, but the gloom seemed to lie oddly across her face, concealing most of it in loamy red shadows. And to her stillness, like something made of plaster, not a breath, not a whisper of air through her curls, not a twitch of emotion across her face. She flickered. It was the smallest movement, like an old video recording. Claire's entire body seemed to twist in on itself, her head jolting to the side, her neck jarring, her limbs sharp and jagged. Then she snapped back into place, as if the entire thing had never happened. Simon drew back, his grip tightening on the banister. It still felt sticky beneath his hand. Claire, he whispered. Claire smiled.
Simon.
She tilted her head, her form still flickering in the dying sunlight.
I can't tell you how glad we are to catch you in time.
Her voice was Claire's, but also not. Claire without Claire's subtle intonations, Claire's uncertainty, Claire's smile, a passable but flat imitation. Simon took a stumbling step back. The floorboards resisted his movement, dragging away something thick and red as he tried to lift his foot. He managed to stagger 2 steps back up the stairs before something slithering wrapped around his fingers, dragging them tight against the handrail. Simon let out a yelp of surprise. He turned, trying to pull free from whatever grabbed him, and froze, staring in horror at his hand. A thin pink tendril had stretched from out of the wall and wrapped around his knuckles. As he watched, the second rose haltingly, almost curiously, and brushed his wrist. It stung where it touched, leaving a slick red residue behind. Simon let out a low moan, looking around himself in disbelief. The sun had set almost completely now. All that slanted through the window high above was a dull reddish hue, painting the staircase in shades of musty pink. In the new gloom, the walls seemed to pulse, heaving inward and outward in a soft, careful rhythm, as if the stairwell itself was breathing. The tiny hairs he'd noticed before had grown longer. They stretched out from the walls, twisting and grasping, an entire stairwell of spindly growths, reaching blindly in the darkness. Claire was still watching from down below, seemingly nonplussed by this grotesqueness. With a yelp, Simon ripped himself free and staggered back up the stairs. Something sharp wrapped around his ankle as he ran. He stumbled, smacking his knee on the top step as he fell, and scrambled to stand as more fleshy tendrils snaked down from the walls, rising from the floorboards to snatch him. Soft footsteps sounded on the stairs behind him.
We watched you arrive,
said Claire, softly, as she advanced.
How boldly you entered this place. We wanted to thank you, personally.
Thank me? Simon tried to force down the dread rising in his chest, his voice cracking as he staggered to his feet. Look, this isn't funny, alright? Whatever you've done. Claire shook her head, the movement careful, as if being performed for the first time.
This was all you, Simon.
Simon drew back. Every inch of him wanted to push past her and bolt down the stairs, sprint for the front door, drive away into the night, alone if he had to. But even a glimpse past Claire's advancing body was enough to squash that hope. Darkness swallowed the landing below them, total, impenetrable darkness. No way down. No steps to take him away from this. He was alone up here, with this Claire who wasn't Claire, in a hotel he'd entered without telling anyone. Nowhere left to go but up. Simon spun, panic driving his movements as he wrenched himself towards the upward staircase. He'd been frozen for too long. Tendrils from the floorboards had seized the opportunity and wound tight around his legs, twisting like ancient ivy. Simon staggered, unable to keep his balance. He hit the landing hard, sending up waves of dust. Tendrils wrapped around his ankles, sliding through the fabric of his trousers, enfolding the hand at his side and squirming, twisting flesh. Their touch stung. The scent like copper filled the stairwell, making Simon gag. He struggled to his knees, gasping for breath, thrusting out a hand to grasp the lower step of the staircase above him. If he could just pull himself free. If he could just... Claire appeared above him, gazing down with her unblinking eyes. Up close, she looked even less like the Claire Simon knew. With her perfectly curled hair and smiling mouth, her teeth shining, her unblinking eyes bright and wide, she looked like an impression of Claire, like something he might have concocted on a photo shoot. She flickered again, a sudden twisting of shape and form, so sudden it was almost a blink, a VHS distortion dragged into the real world. Simon flinched back, small whimper escaping his throat. A single thought flitted through his mind, sharp against the bright lights of fear. Where was the real Claire? Claire smiled, reached down to stroke Simon's sweat-covered forehead.
We happened so slowly,
She whispered.
Even we didn't realize at first. People came and left, and we remained behind. Every word ever uttered, every moment ever shared, collecting in dark corners, clustered on the edges of this place.
Please. This hurts.
We envied those who had left us behind. We envied the new guests who arrived to replace them. We understood that we were bound to these walls, so easily fragmented by the outside world.
Claire smiled sadly, brushing a hand over the deep red walls.
And then you came.
What are you? Simon whispered. Claire laughed. If you listened hard enough, Simon could almost hear something at the edges of her voice, soft creaking, like a house settling at night. She leaned forward and took a deep breath of rattling air, seemingly delighted at the sound.
We are you.
You're not Claire. You're something wrong. Simon could feel himself slipping off the edges of hysteria. He pulled weakly at the tendrils still wrapping around his arms. Please, I'm sorry. We shouldn't have come here. We shouldn't have done whatever it is we've done. Just let me go.
Let you go?
Claire's flickering face registered confusion. Simon closed his eyes, suppressing a sob at his own numbed legs, the slick redness seeping from beneath the tendrils attached to his arms, his chest, weaving through his hair. He pictured them continuing up into the depths of the hotel, through disused stairwells and unseen rooms, weaving and twisting, forming something else. He could feel them in his bones, snapping at the edges of his vision, mingling with that ever-present thud of footsteps overhead, so eager, so hungry, gnawing away tiny pieces bit by bit, memorizing him.
This was all your work.
Claire smiled.
You brought them here. You locked them in. You made this possible.
No! Panic surged through Simon's body. It wasn't like that!
Wasn't it?
Claire asked. Simon hesitated. He was the reason the crew had come to this place after all. He was the reason they'd gotten inside. He'd ordered them all to go after Claire. A movement from the side caught Simon's attention, wrenching him momentarily from his terror. The fleshy walls were still contracting in their slow, laborious way, forming small gaps where two sections met. Through the gap closest to him, Simon could just make out another section of the hotel. A large, dark room, furniture shapes rising in the darkness. Through the open doorway spilled distant torchlight, reflecting off a familiar grey hoodie and dark brown curls. A familiar face turned away to scan the corridor behind them. Simon's heart leapt. Alex? He could call out to them, scream at them to run, to help him. He could tell them he was sorry. Simon opened his mouth, his tongue sandpaper dry.
Imagine it.
Whispered Claire, an inch from his ear.
Everything you've ever wanted.
Simon flinched.
Leave now and you'll never know.
Claire continued.
You'll lie awake at night wondering what you might have found, the film you might have made.
Out beyond the doorway, Alex turned to look ahead, sweeping their torchlight across the doorway without glancing inside or spotting Simon. They started forward, their worried expression lit by the harsh white glow. Soon they'd be too far away to call out to, too far away to hear.
We know you, Simon.
Continued Claire in a whisper.
We've tasted your desires. We know what you want. We've seen how hard you work.
Alex vanished around the corner. Claire pressed something heavy into Simon's uncovered grip. He blinked numbly down at it. It was Philippa's camera. The one she'd left on the lobby landing. The light on top flashed like a watching eye.
A real haunting,
Claire whispered. Somewhere up ahead, someone let out a soft, tuneless whistle. Footsteps sounded again on the floor above, louder now. Someone was descending the stairs, coming down to meet them. Even with his heart pounding in his ears, the soft throbbing of the hotel rising and falling around him. Simon would recognize his own gait anywhere. "What are you going to do with me?" he whispered. Claire smiled. His fingers that seemed more like fingers helped guide his hands to the right places, press the right buttons to prep the camera.
You'll have your chance to leave, eventually.
She said.
You'll just have to wait. Like we did.
In the depths of his haze, surrounded by the walls that were no longer walls, in the grip of a creature that had never really been Claire, some small part of Simon knew he still had the choice to fight back. He could resist this. He could still say no. The rest of him knew it didn't matter. If he turned now, he would see nothing but a blank expanse of darkness beyond the stairs. No doorway, no landing, no escape. He realized that of all the organs in a hotel's body, he'd forgotten the most important aspect of all, the stomach. As the footsteps turned the last corner towards them, Simon raised the camera to his eye, ready to direct his final shot. The hotel was produced by the story studio Hawk Cleaver. To support the studio in this and all of our productions, please consider becoming a TOS Plus member over at theotherstories.net/plus or a patron over at patreon.com/Hawk Cleaver. The Hotel was written by Georgia Cook, produced by Duncan Muggleton. Justin Fife plays the role of Ian, Georgia Cook plays the role of Claire, Erica Ventura plays the role of Philippa, Safia Ingar plays the role of Alex, and Luke Condor plays the role of Simon. The hotel theme music and soundtrack were created by Duncan Muggleton, and sound effects were provided by freesound.org. Georgia Cook is an illustrator and writer from London. She has written for publications such as Baffling, Visterian Lit and Flame Tree Press, as well as a Doctor Who range with Big Finish. She can be found on X at Georgia Cooked or on her website at georgiacookwriter.com. The Other Stories is a production of the Story Studio Hawk Cleaver and is brought to you with Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives License. That means don't change it, don't sell it, but by all means share the hell out of it. So, until next time.